Miss Marple and the Poisoned Bridegroom. Welcome to Cafe Tales. I am Ailey, your host, and it's always a joy to see our community gathered together. Tell me, what makes these mysteries special for you? Share in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe so you can join us for a new story each day. Now let's start tonight's mystery. Chapter 1, The Wedding at St. Mildred's. The month of June had arrived in the village of Elmsby, with all the gentle persuasion of an old friend. The hedgerows were thick with white hawthorn, the cottage gardens blazed with early roses, and on this particular Saturday morning, the bells of St. Mildred's rang out across the meadows with that special brilliance reserved for weddings. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the third pew from the back, adjusted her lavender gloves and reflected that there was nothing quite so hopeful as a June wedding. She had come to Elmsby to visit her cousin Mabel, who lived in a charming stone cottage just beyond the village green, and the invitation to attend young Harold Brent's wedding had been extended with that casual warmth so characteristic of village hospitality. The church was not large, but it had been decorated with considerable taste. White lilies stood in great urns at the altar, and someone had woven ivy and white roses through the ends of the pews. Miss Marple noted the simplicity with approval. There was something refreshing about a wedding that did not strain toward grandeur. The organ began to play and the congregation rose. Miss Marple turned along with everyone else to watch the bride make her entrance. Alice Linton came up the aisle on her father's arm, a picture of modest beauty in cream silk and Brussels lace. She was a tall girl, perhaps 25, with dark hair and a complexion that spoke of good health and sensible living. Her expression was serene, though Miss Marple detected a slight tremor in the hand that held her bouquet of lily of the valley. Nerves, of course, perfectly natural. Mr. Linton, the bride's father, was a prosperous gentleman farmer, ruddy-faced and clearly moved by the occasion. He walked with dignity, though Miss Marple observed him blink rather rapidly as they approached the altar. At the front of the church stood Harold Brent, the bridegroom. He was a pleasant-looking young man of perhaps 29, with light brown hair and an open countenance. Miss Marple thought he had the sort of face that inspired confidence, honest and straightforward. He wore his morning coat with ease, and when Alice reached his side, he smiled at her with what appeared to be genuine affection. The best man, a tall fellow with spectacles, fumbled briefly with the ring, but recovered himself admirably. Miss Marple smiled. There was always something endearing about the small mishaps that attended even the most carefully planned ceremonies. The vicar, Reverend Clement, conducted the service with appropriate solemnity. His voice carried well through the church, and Miss Marple found herself reflecting that he had quite recovered from the laryngitis that had plagued him last winter. Her cousin Mabel had written about it at length, but it was during the final hymn that Miss Marple's attention was drawn to a figure in the front pew. Mrs. Brent, the groom's mother, stood with her hymnal unopened in her hands. She was a handsome woman of perhaps 55, dressed in dove-gray silk with a very elegant hat. Her pearls were genuine, and her bearing suggested a woman accustomed to respect. Yet her face was oddly still, and her eyes, fixed upon her son's back, held an expression that Miss Marple found difficult to interpret. It was not the tender emotion one might expect from a mother watching her only son marry. It was something else entirely. Anxiety, perhaps, or was it something more troubling? Miss Marple had seen that look before. It reminded her of Mrs. Calthrop back in St. Mary Mead on the day her son had announced he was immigrating to Australia. That same tight control, that same inward struggle between love and something darker. In Mrs. Calthrop's case, it had been possessiveness. One wondered what it might be in Mrs. Brent's. The ceremony concluded, and the wedding party proceeded to the vestry for the signing of the register. Miss Marple remained in her pew, watching as the guests began to mill about, greeting one another and making their way slowly toward the church door. Her cousin Mabel appeared at her elbow. Mabel was a comfortable, gossipy woman who knew everyone's business and delighted in sharing it. "Such a lovely ceremony," Mabel whispered. Though I must say, Mrs. Brent looked quite peculiar during the vows. "Did you notice? Almost as if she were about to be ill." "Perhaps the emotion of the occasion," Miss Marple suggested mildly. "Emotion? That woman has a heart of stone. Jane always has done. Why, when Harold was courting that nice calling girl 2 years ago, she put a stop to it faster than you could say knife. Said the girl wasn't suitable, though everyone knew Vera Calling was perfectly respectable. Worked as a secretary at the county offices." Miss Marple's interest quickened, though her expression remained placid. "Indeed, and what happened to Miss Calling?" "Oh, she's still about. Lives in one of the cottages on the Harbury Road. Harold broke it off quite suddenly, and the poor girl was devastated. Some said he'd been made to choose between her and his inheritance from his uncle, though that's just village talk, of course." "Of course," Miss Marple murmured. The bride and groom emerged from the vestry, beaming despite the constraint of formal photographs. Alice had thrown back her veil and her face was flushed with happiness. Harold held her arm with protective care. Mrs. Brent followed a few paces behind. As she passed Miss Marple's pew, she paused to adjust her gloves. Miss Marple heard her speak, though whether to herself or to her companion, a thin woman in brown, was unclear. "Well, it's done now. It's done, and nothing can undo it." The words were spoken with a curious intensity, and the thin woman replied in a soothing tone, "Now, Margaret, you mustn't take on so. What's done is done, as you say." Mrs. Brent straightened her shoulders and moved on, her face once again composed. Miss Marple filed the exchange away in that capacious memory of hers, where such observations accumulated like specimens in a naturalist's collection. Outside the church, the June sunshine was brilliant. Confetti flew through the air, and the photographer arranged the wedding party on the church steps. Miss Marple stood in the shade of an ancient yew tree, watching the happy chaos. It was then that she noticed the woman standing apart from the other guests, half hidden behind a stone monument. She was perhaps C, with fair hair and a thin, unhappy face. She wore a gray coat that had seen better days, and she was staring at Harold Brent with an expression of such naked longing that Miss Marple felt a pang of sympathy. "That's Vera Calling," Mabel whispered, having followed her cousin's gaze. "Bold as brass, coming here when she wasn't even invited. Some people have no shame." But Miss Marple thought it was not shamelessness she saw in that pale face. It was grief, pure and simple. The grief of a woman who had lost something precious and could not quite accept the loss. The bride and groom climbed into a waiting motor car, and the guests began to make their way toward the Linton house for the wedding breakfast. Miss Marple took her cousin's arm and walked slowly down the path, her mind already cataloging the small discordances of the morning. A mother's strange anxiety, a former sweetheart's sorrowful presence, the curious words spoken in the church. It was probably nothing. Weddings always brought out complicated emotions. But Miss Marple had learned over many years of quiet observation that nothing was ever quite as simple as it seemed. Human nature, like a garden, often concealed its deepest roots beneath a surface of perfect blooms. She would watch and she would listen, and if there was anything amiss beneath the flowers and the laughter, Miss Marple had little doubt that it would reveal itself in time. Chapter 2. The Toast That Turned Cold. The Linton house stood at the end of a tree-lined drive, a substantial Georgian residence with cream-colored walls and windows that caught the afternoon sun. As Miss Marple arrived with her cousin, she observed that the front lawn had been set with several long tables covered in white damask, and a striped marquee had been erected near the rose garden. It was all very pleasant, and Miss Marple thought, quite in keeping with the sensible character of the bride's family. Not ostentatious, but comfortable. The sort of wedding breakfast where one might actually enjoy the food and conversation, rather than being overwhelmed by unnecessary spectacle. The guests had begun to assemble, moving in cheerful clusters across the lawn. A string quartet played something light and Mozart-like from beneath a copper beech. Waiters circulated with trays of champagne, and the scent of early summer roses mingled with the sharper fragrance of the cold salmon that was being arranged on the buffet table. Miss Marple accepted a glass of lemonade from a passing maid and found a seat near the marquee entrance, where she might observe without being obtrusive. Her cousin Mabel had already been captured by Mrs. Dane, the vicar's wife, and was deep in a conversation about the flower arrangements. The bride and groom arrived to a ripple of applause. They moved among their guests with natural grace, Alice's hand resting lightly on Harold's arm. Miss Marple noticed that Mrs. Brent had positioned herself near the main refreshment table, her eyes following her son's progress across the lawn with that same peculiar intensity she had displayed in the church. "Quite the successful match," remarked a voice beside her. Miss Marple turned to find an elderly gentleman settling into the adjacent chair. He was perhaps 70, with white whiskers and a kindly face. His morning coat bore the slight sheen of age, though it had been carefully brushed. "Dr. Haddock," he introduced himself. "I've been the family physician for the Brents these 30 years. You must be Miss Marple, Mabel Fletcher's cousin." "Indeed I am." "How do you do, Dr. Haddock?" "Very well, thank you. Though I confess I always find weddings rather exhausting. So much emotion concentrated in one day. It's a wonder more people don't collapse from the sheer intensity of it all." Miss Marple smiled. "I suppose the heart can bear more strain than we sometimes imagine." "In most cases, yes, though not in all." There was something in his tone that made Miss Marple glance at him more sharply. But before she could inquire further, a clinking of glass called everyone's attention to the head table. Mr. Linton, the bride's father, stood to make the first speech. He was brief and touching, speaking of his daughter's childhood, and his joy at seeing her marry such a worthy young man. His voice wavered only once when he mentioned his late wife, who had not lived to see this day. The best man followed with a speech that was perhaps too lengthy and contained several jokes that fell rather flat, but he was young and earnest, and the guests received him kindly. Then it was time for the toast. The waiters had filled everyone's glass, and a particular bottle of champagne had been opened for the bride and groom. Miss Marple noticed that the maid who poured it was a nervously-looking girl with red hands and a tendency to glance anxiously toward Mrs. Brent. She filled Harold's glass with particular care, then Alice's, and stepped back quickly, as if relieved to have completed the task. Mr. Linton raised his glass. "To the bride and groom. May they have many years of happiness together." "The bride and groom," the guests echoed. Harold Brent lifted his glass to his lips and drank deeply. Alice sipped more delicately, laughing at something her new husband whispered to her. The moment was perfect, suspended in golden afternoon light. Then Harold's expression changed. It was subtle at first, a slight frown, a hand raised to his throat. Miss Marple, watching from her vantage point, saw the color drain from his face. He set down his glass with a sharp click against the table. "Harold?" Alice's voice carried a note of concern. He tried to speak, but no words came. His hand clutched at his collar, pulling at it as if it had suddenly become too tight. His breathing grew labored, harsh. "Harold!" Alice's voice rose to a scream. The young man staggered sideways, his chair toppling as he fell. Several guests rushed forward, but it was Dr. Haddock who urged him first, kneeling beside the fallen groom with practiced efficiency. Miss Marple remained in her seat, though every instinct urged her to join the crowd now pressing around the stricken man. She had learned long ago that in moments of crisis there were those who acted and those who observed, and that both had their place. What she observed was this: Mrs. Brent standing frozen by the refreshment table, her face chalk white, but her eyes strangely dry. The maid with the red hands backing away toward the house, one hand pressed to her mouth, and on the head table, untouched beside Harold's fallen glass, a slice of wedding cake with its white icing, pristine and perfect. Dr. Haddock's voice cut through the rising panic. "Everyone step back, please. Give him air." But Miss Marple could see, even from her distance, that air would do no good. The doctor's face had taken on the grim set of a man who knows his skills are insufficient to the moment. Alice knelt beside her husband, her wedding dress pooling around her on the grass. She held his hand, speaking his name over and over, but Harold Brent's eyes had already taken on the fixed stare that Miss Marple recognized from too many village deathbeds. The clock on the stable tower began to strike. By the time the last chime faded, Harold Brent was dead. The afternoon dissolved into chaos. Someone sent for the constable. Someone else led Alice, now sobbing uncontrollably, into the house. Guests clustered in shocked groups, speaking in hushed voices. The string quartet had fallen silent, the instruments abandoned. Miss Marple rose quietly from her chair and moved toward the head table. The crowd had dispersed somewhat, drawn either toward the house or toward each other in their need for comfort and explanation. No one paid attention to an elderly lady in lavender. She bent over the table, her keen eyes taking in every detail. Harold's glass still stood where he had set it down, a small amount of champagne remaining in the bottom. She leaned closer, inhaling carefully. There it was, faint but unmistakable beneath the yeasty scent of the wine, the bitter smell of almonds. Miss Marple straightened, her face troubled. She had encountered that smell before in circumstances that had ended badly. It was not a natural scent, not something that belonged at a wedding breakfast on a June afternoon. Dr. Haddock approached, wiping his hands with his handkerchief. His expression was grave. "Heart failure," he said quietly, though Miss Marple had not asked. "Sudden and catastrophic. The poor young man. I had no idea his heart was weak." "Had you examined him recently?" "6 months ago for a life insurance policy. He was perfectly sound." "This is most irregular." Miss Marple said nothing, but her gaze returned to the glass with its telltale residue. "Heart failure, perhaps." But hearts did not fail for no reason, and that bitter scent of almond suggested a reason both ancient and terrible. She looked across the lawn to where Mrs. Brent sat on a garden bench, surrounded by solicitous friends. The woman's face was composed now, almost serene. As Miss Marple watched, Mrs. Brent raised her eyes and met her gaze. For a moment something passed between them, recognition perhaps, or warning. Then Mrs. Brent looked away and the moment was gone. Chapter 3: A Cup for the Groom. The house had taken on the hushed atmosphere of a place where death has made an unexpected visit. The servants moved about with muted steps, and in the drawing room, Alice Brent, Miss Marple reminded herself, though the marriage had lasted less than an hour, sat pale and still in a wing chair while various ladies attempted to offer comfort. Miss Marple had withdrawn to the morning room, ostensibly to rest, but in reality to think. The bitter almond scent lingered in her memory with uncomfortable persistence. She had smelled it once before, many years ago, when old Colonel Bantry's gardener had died after drinking what he thought was his lunch tea. That had been cyanide administered by a jealous rival. An ugly business, but mercifully straightforward once the facts were established. This, however, was not straightforward at all. Through the window she could see the constable, a stolid young man named Polker, speaking with Dr. Haddock near the marquee. The doctor's gestures were emphatic, and Miss Marple suspected he was insisting on his diagnosis of heart failure. Natural causes were always more comfortable than the alternative. A discreet tap at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Excuse me, miss." It was the maid with the red hands, the same girl who had poured the champagne for the bride and groom. She carried a tea tray and her hands trembled slightly as she set it down. "Mrs. Linton thought you might like some refreshment." "How very kind." "And what is your name, my dear?" "Annie, miss." "Annie Frost." "Thank you, Annie. Such a dreadful thing to happen. You must be very shocked." The girl's eyes filled with tears. "Oh, miss, it was horrible. Just horrible, and him so young and everything. I keep thinking, what if it was something in the food? What if we all get sick?" Miss Marple poured herself a cup of tea with steady hands. "I don't think you need worry about that." "No one else has been taken ill, have they?" "No, miss. Just Mr. Harold." Annie twisted her apron. "It don't seem right, does it? 1 minute drinking a toast, the next minute gone." "You poured that champagne yourself, didn't you? I noticed you at the table." The girl's face went even paler. "I did, miss. Mrs. Brent told me special to pour from the bottle with the blue ribbon around it. She said it was the best vintage reserved for the happy couple. Oh, Lord, what if there was something wrong with it? What if I've killed him? Now, my dear, I'm quite sure you did nothing wrong." Miss Marple's voice was soothing, but her mind was racing. "Mrs. Brent specifically told you which bottle to use?" "Yes, miss. She was most particular about it. Said the bride had requested a special toast, something romantic-like. So I was topper from that bottle and no other." "And did you open the bottle yourself?" Annie shook her head. "No, miss. It was already open when I got to the table, just sitting there with the ribbon on it. I thought maybe Mrs. Brent had opened it earlier, making sure everything was ready." Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. "Did you happen to see Mrs. Brent near the refreshment table before the ceremony?" "Well, yes, miss. She was there quite a bit this morning overseeing things. Very particular she is. Wanted everything just so." "I'm sure she did. Tell me, Annie, what became of that bottle afterwards? The one with the blue ribbon?" The maid looked uncertain. "I couldn't say, miss. After Mr. Harold fell, everything was such confusion. I expect it's still out there on the table unless someone cleared it away." "Thank you, Annie. You've been very helpful." The girl bobbed a curtsy and hurried out, clearly relieved to escape further questioning. Miss Marple set down her teacup and rose. The others might be content to accept Dr. Haddock's explanation of heart failure, but she had not lived 70-odd years in various English villages without learning that convenient explanations were often the least accurate ones. She made her way through the quiet house and out to the lawn where the wedding breakfast stood abandoned. The tables were still set, the food congealing sadly in the afternoon heat. Wasps had discovered the trifle, and someone had draped white cloths over the chairs, giving the scene a ghostly appearance. The head table stood apart, a monument to interrupted joy. Miss Marple approached it carefully, conscious that Constable Pulcher was still visible near the marquee, though his back was turned. The glasses remained where they had been left. Alice's showed the faint trace of lipstick on the rim and was perhaps half empty. Harold's contained only a small amount of champagne in the bottom, and as Miss Marple leaned over it, she caught again that telltale scent of almonds, stronger now than before. She looked around for the bottle Annie had mentioned, but it was nowhere to be seen. Someone had removed it. Then that was interesting. What she did find, however, was a small damp spot on the white tablecloth near where Harold's glass had stood. She touched it with one finger and brought it to her nose. Champagne, certainly, but something else as well, something bitter. "Miss Marple." She turned to find Alice standing a few feet away. The girl had changed from her wedding dress into a simple gray frock, and her face was swollen from weeping. She looked very young and very lost. "My dear child, you should be resting." "I can't rest. I can't do anything." Alice moved closer, her eyes fixed on Thedable. "They're saying it was his heart, that he had a weak heart and nobody knew." "But that's not true, Miss Marple. Harold was examined just this spring for a life insurance policy. The doctor said he was sound as a bell." "Yes, Dr. Haddock mentioned the examination." Alice's voice dropped to a whisper. "Then how did he die? What happened to him?" Miss Marple chose her words carefully. "These things are sometimes mysterious, my dear. The human body can be unpredictable. But you don't believe that. It was not a question. Alice's eyes, red-rimmed though they were, held a sharp intelligence. I saw you smelling his glass. You think there was something in it, don't you? There was no point in dissembling. I think it's possible. Alice swayed slightly, and Miss Marple quickly guided her to a chair. The girl sat down heavily, her hands clenched in her lap. "It's my fault," she whispered. "I asked for the special toast. I wanted everything to be perfect, and I thought it would be romantic if we had our own private bottle of champagne, something special just for us. I mentioned it to Mrs. Brent yesterday when we were planning the breakfast, and she said she'd arrange it. Oh God, if I hadn't asked. You mustn't blame yourself. You had no way of knowing. But don't you see? If someone put something in that bottle, it was because I asked for it to be separate from the others. I made it easy for them." Miss Marple regarded the young woman with sympathy and a growing respect. "You believe someone deliberately harmed your husband?" "I don't want to believe it, but Harold was healthy, Miss Marple. He was strong and well, and then he drinks one glass of champagne and dies." "How can't that be natural?" "It cannot," Miss Marple said quietly. "And I think, my dear, that we must discover the truth, however painful it may be." Alice raised her eyes, and in them, Miss Marple saw a determination that reminded her of herself at a younger age. "Then will you help me? Will you help me find out who killed my husband?" Miss Marple thought of the bitter almond scent, of Mrs. Brent's strange composure, of the missing champagne bottle, and the maid's frightened face. She thought of justice and truth, and the dark currents that ran beneath even the most tranquil village surfaces. "Yes," she said, "I will help you, though I must warn you the truth may not be what you wish to hear. I only wish to hear the truth, whatever it may be." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Romance," she had said to Annie, "is often mixed with danger when poured in haste." She had not known then how prophetic those words would prove. But she knew now that before this was finished, more than romance would be tested. Lives would be examined, secrets revealed, and someone's carefully constructed facade would crumble to reveal the poisoner beneath. Chapter 4: The Jealous Invitation. Sunday morning brought low gray clouds and a fine drizzle that matched the mood of the village. Miss Marple attended the early service at St. Mildred's, where Reverend Clement spoke movingly, if somewhat vaguely, about the mysteries of Providence. The church was fuller than usual, she noted. Tragedy always brought people together, though whether from sympathy or curiosity was often difficult to determine. Mrs. Brent was not present, having sent word that she was prostrate with grief. Alice attended, dressed in black and supported by her father. The girl's composure was remarkable, Miss Marple thought, though she detected a steeliness beneath the pale exterior that had not been there 2 days before. After the service, Miss Marple declined her cousin Mabel's invitation to lunch, and instead took a solitary walk along the lane that led toward the village green. The rain had eased to a light mist, and the hedgerows dripped with moisture. It was the sort of morning that invited contemplation, and Miss Marple had much to contemplate. Dr. Haddock had been adamant about heart failure, but he had also agreed when pressed to delay signing the death certificate until certain inquiries could be made. The champagne bottle had not been found, which was significant in itself. And then there was the matter of the letter. Constable Pulcher had mentioned it to her cousin Mabel, who had naturally passed the information along. The letter had been found in Harold Brent's coat pocket during the necessary examination of his effects, a threatening letter, unsigned, warning him against the marriage. Miss Marple had not yet seen this letter, but she intended to remedy that omission as soon as possible. She was considering how best to approach Constable Pulcher when she noticed a woman standing at the entrance to the churchyard. Even from a distance, Miss Marple recognized her. It was Vera Calling, the former sweetheart who had watched the wedding with such anguished eyes. Miss Marple approached slowly, her footsteps soft on the wet grass. Vera stood before a modest gravestone, her head bowed, seemingly unaware of anyone's presence. "Good morning," Miss Marple said gently. The woman started and turned. In the gray morning light, her face looked older than it had appeared on Saturday. There were shadows beneath her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. "Oh, good morning." Vera's voice was uncertain, as if she were not quite sure whether conversation was welcome. "I'm sorry if I disturbed you. I'm Miss Marple, visitor to the village." "Yes, I saw you at the wedding." Vera's expression grew guarded. "Everyone's talking about you. They say you're asking questions about what happened to Harold." "I'm merely trying to understand the circumstances. Such a terrible tragedy." Vera looked back at the gravestone. "This is where my mother is buried. I come here when I need to think. She always knew what to do. Mom did. She'd know what to tell Menno." Miss Marple waited, having learned long ago that silence often prompted confidences more effectively than questions. "They're saying I was there," Vera continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "At the church, that I came uninvited, that I was jealous and bitter and wished them ill. Were you there?" "Yes, I couldn't help myself. I had to see Hamon last time, even if it was watching him marry someone else." Tears began to run down Vera's thin face. "But I never wished him dead. Never. I loved him. I still love him. God help me. No one has suggested you wished him dead. Surely, haven't they? You should hear what they're saying in the village. That I must have poisoned him somehow. That I sent him threatening letters. That I'm a vengeful woman who couldn't bear to lose him." Miss Marple's interest sharpened. "Threatening letters. More than one?" Vera shook her head. "I don't know. I only know about the one they found in his pocket. The constable came to see me yesterday afternoon. He showed it to me and asked if I'd written it." "And had you?" "No, I swear I didn't, but it was my handwriting." Vera's voice rose with distress. "That's what's so terrible. The letter was written in handwriting that looked exactly like mine, but I never wrote those words. I never wrote anything threatening to Harold." "What did the letter say?" Vera fumbled in her handbag and produced a folded piece of paper. "The constable let me copy it out. He said not to leave the village, that there would be more questions." Here, she handed the paper to Miss Marple, who unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was neat, perhaps too neat. Each letter formed with deliberate precision. "If you marry her, it will be the end of everything," Miss Marple read aloud. "That does sound rather ominous. But I didn't write it. Why would I? Harold had already ended things between us months ago. I'd accepted it as much as one can accept such things. I had no reason to threaten him. When did he end the engagement?" "Last October. He came to see him one evening and said it was over. He wouldn't give me a proper reason, just said he'd received news that changed everything. News about money, he said, and that he had to think of his future." Miss Marple folded the paper thoughtfully. "Did he mention what sort of news?" "No, but I assumed it had something to do with his uncle's will. There had been talk in the village that old Mr. Brent had left Harold a substantial inheritance, but with conditions attached. Harold wouldn't discuss it with me, though. He just said goodbye and walked away, and I haven't spoken to him since." "Until Saturday." Vera's face crumpled. "I didn't speak to him Saturday either. I just watched from behind the monument. I saw him smile at Alice, saw him look so happy, and I thought my heart would break. But I didn't wish him dead, Miss Marple. You must believe me." Miss Marple studied the young woman carefully. There was genuine grief in her face and something else as well. Fear, perhaps, or guilt. But was it the guilt of murder or merely the guilt of the survivor who had harbored uncharitable thoughts? "Tell me," Miss Marple said gently. "Do you know Mrs. Brent?" Well, the question seemed to surprise Vera. "Harold's mother. Yes, I suppose so. She never liked me, if that's what you're asking. She made that quite clear when Harold and I were courting. Said I wasn't good enough for her son. that he could do better. And yet she appears to have accepted Alice Linton. Alice has money and connections. I'm just a secretary. The bitterness in Vera's voice was unmistakable. Mrs. Brent cares very much about such things. I see. And this letter, if you didn't write it, who might have done so? Who would know your handwriting well enough to copy it? Vera was silent for a long moment. I don't know. I work in an office, so various people see my handwriting regularly, and I wrote to Harold often when we were courting. Those letters might still exist somewhere. In his possession, possibly, or his mother might have kept them. She was always very interested in our correspondence. Harold mentioned once that she'd read some of my letters without his permission. Miss Marple nodded slowly. The pieces were beginning to arrange themselves into a pattern, though not yet a complete picture. A letter in forged handwriting, a broken engagement following news about an inheritance, a mother's peculiar anxiety at her son's wedding. Miss Colling, I wonder if you would do something for me. Would you write out that threatening sentence again, in your natural hand? Not copying, just writing it as you normally would. Vera looked puzzled but compliant. Miss Marple produced a small notebook and pencil from her handbag, and Vera wrote carefully on a fresh page. Miss Marple compared the two versions. The handwriting was similar, certainly, but there were subtle differences. Vera's natural hand was more relaxed, the letters flowing together slightly. The version from Harold's pocket was stiffer, more controlled, as if someone had been concentrating very hard on forming each letter correctly. Thank you, my dear. That's most helpful. Do you believe me, then, that I didn't write the original? I believe, Miss Marple said carefully, that the truth is often more complicated than it first appears. Someone wanted Harold to receive that letter, and someone wanted it to appear that you had written it. The question is why? Vera's eyes widened. You mean someone was trying to cast suspicion on me? But who would do such a thing? Miss Marple thought of Mrs. Brent's composed face, of the missing champagne bottle, of the elaborate care with which that fatal toast had been arranged. She thought of inheritance and jealousy and the terrible things that people did when love twisted into possessiveness. That, she said quietly, is what we must discover. Chapter 5. The Letter from London. By Monday afternoon, the village of Elmsby had settled into that peculiar state of heightened gossip that follows any scandal. Miss Marple, making her way to the post office for stamps, overheard at least 3 separate conversations, each more fanciful than the last. Vera Colling had been arrested, according to Mrs. Dane. Harold Brent had been poisoned by tainted shellfish, according to the butcher's wife. The entire affair was a judgment from heaven, according to Mr. Sims, who saw divine retribution in everything from thunderstorms to rheumatism. Miss Marple purchased her stamps and was about to leave when Constable Polker entered, looking unusually grave. Ah, Miss Marple, I was hoping it might encounter you. There's been a development. Indeed? A gentleman has arrived from London, a solicitor by the name of Whitworth. He's asking to speak with the family, and Dr. Haddock suggested you might wish to be present as well, given your acquaintance with Mrs. Brent. This last was said with a careful neutrality of a man who understood that Miss Marple's acquaintance with Mrs. Brent was minimal at best, but who also recognized that their presence might prove useful. How very thoughtful of Dr. Haddock. When is this meeting to take place? Within the hour at the Linton house. Mr. Whitworth has information about Mr. Harold Brent's affairs that he considers urgent. Miss Marple reflected that solicitors generally considered financial matters urgent, only when they involve substantial sums or questionable legality. Either prospect was interesting. I shall certainly attend if Mrs. Linton wishes it. She does, miss. She asked for you specifically. The gathering assembled in the Linton drawing-room had the uncomfortable air of people who would rather be anywhere else. Alice sat near the window, still in her black dress, her face pale but determined. Mr. Linton stood beside the fireplace, looking older than he had on Saturday. Mrs. Brent occupied the sofa, her posture rigid, her hands folded precisely in her lap. Dr. Haddock had positioned himself near the door as if ready to administer medical assistance should anyone require it. Miss Marple took a chair near Alice, offering the girl a small, encouraging smile. Mr. Whitworth proved to be a thin gentleman of perhaps 60, with steel-rimmed spectacles and the precise manner of a man who spent his days managing other people's complications. He set his leather case on the table and addressed the room with formal courtesy. "Thank you all for seeing me on such short notice. I apologize for intruding at this difficult time, but certain matters have come to light that require immediate clarification." "What sort of matters?" Mr. Linton's voice was gruff. "Matters pertaining to the late Mr. Harold Brent's inheritance." Mr. Whitworth opened his case and withdrew several documents. "I represented his uncle, the late Mr. Edmund Brent, and I am executor of that gentleman's estate. As some of you may know, Mr. Edmund Brent left a substantial sum to his nephew Harold." Mrs. Brent spoke for the first time, her voice tight. "That's correct. $40,000. Harold inherited it 6 months ago." "Not precisely, Mrs. Brent." Mr. Whitworth's tone was gentle but firm. "The will contained a specific condition that has only recently become relevant. May I read the pertinent clause?" He adjusted his spectacles and read from the document before him. "I leave my nephew Harold James Brent the sum of $40,000 to be held in trust until his 30th birthday. However, should Harold marry before reaching the age of 30 years, the entire sum shall pass instead to his mother, Margaret Brent, as I believe him too young to manage such wealth while burdened with the responsibilities of matrimony." The silence that followed was profound. Alice's hand flew to her mouth. "His 30th birthday? When was that?" Mr. Whitworth consulted another paper. "Mr. Harold Brent was born on the 14th of June, 1895. His 30th birthday would have been this coming Thursday, the 14th of June." Miss Marple's mind worked rapidly. Saturday had been the 11th. Harold had married 3 days before his 30th birthday, 3 days before the inheritance would have been his without condition. Did Harold know about this clause? Alice's voice was barely audible. "I informed him of it when I read the will last December. He was quite aware of the terms." Miss Marple glanced at Mrs. Brent, whose face had gone the color of old parchment. The woman's hands, previously so still in her lap, now gripped each other with visible force. "This is preposterous," Mrs. Brent said, her voice shaking. "You're suggesting that my son deliberately married before his birthday to spite me, that he would throw away a fortune for sentiment." "I am suggesting nothing, madam. I'm merely stating the facts as they exist in law." Mr. Linton cleared his throat. "But surely since Harold has died, the inheritance passes to his widow. That would be the normal course of things?" Mr. Whitworth shook his head. "The marriage took place before the inheritance was released from trust. Under the terms of the will, Harold's marriage triggered the transfer of funds to his mother. The marriage was legal and binding, but it occurred precisely 3 days too soon for Harold to inherit. So the money goes to Mrs. Brent." Alice's voice held no bitterness, only a kind of numb understanding. "It does, or rather, it already has. The transfer was executed this morning as per the terms of the trust." Miss Marple watched Mrs. Brent's face carefully. The woman's expression was difficult to read, a mixture of emotions too complex to parse. Was that relief? Guilt? Or merely the shock of having one's financial future secured under the most terrible of circumstances? "Mrs. Brent," Miss Marple said quietly, "you seem surprised by this news. Did you not know about the condition in your brother-in-law's will?" The woman's eyes snapped to Miss Marple's face. "Of course I knew. Edmund discussed it with me before he died. He felt Harold was too impulsive, too romantic. He wanted to ensure the money was managed sensibly." Then you knew that Harold's marriage would cost him the inheritance. Yes. I tried to discuss it with him, tried to make him see reason. I told him he should wait just a few more days, but he wouldn't listen. He was determined to marry that girl. Consequences be damned. Alice flinched at the venom in the words, but said nothing. You must have been quite distressed, Miss Marple continued, her tone conversational. Watching your son throw away such a sum. I was heartsick. Any mother would be. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. She remembered Mrs. Brent's words in the church spoken to the thin woman in brown. It's done now. It's done, and nothing can undo it. At the time, she had assumed the woman meant the marriage itself, but perhaps she had meant something else entirely. Dr. Haddock shifted uncomfortably. This is all very interesting, but I'm not sure what bearing it has on Harold's death. The poor man died of heart failure. Did he? Miss Marple's question was mild, but it hung in the air like smoke. Mr. Whitworth closed his case with a decisive snap. That is not for me to determine. I have merely come to clarify the legal position. The inheritance belongs to Mrs. Brent, and there is nothing irregular about that under the terms of the will. Except, Miss Marple said softly, that Harold would have inherited everything if he had lived just 3 more days. The implications settled over the room like a shroud. Mrs. Brent rose abruptly, her face flushed. How dare you? How dare you suggest— I have suggested nothing, Mrs. Brent. I've merely observed that the timing is remarkably unfortunate. Unfortunate? My son is dead. Yes, Miss Marple said. And 40,000 richer. You are his bereaved mother. Chapter 6. The Maid's Discovery. Miss Marple had never believed in coincidence. In her experience, when events aligned with suspicious precision, human agency was usually responsible. A groom who died 3 days before an inheritance condition expired was not the victim of fate, but of calculation. The question was, whose calculation? She had excused herself from the uncomfortable scene in the Linton drawing room and made her way to the kitchen, where she found Annie Frost sitting at the scrubbed wooden table, her face buried in her hands. The girl looked up as Miss Marple entered, her eyes red and swollen. Oh, Miss Marple, I didn't hear you come in. I'm sorry to disturb you, Annie. I thought you might appreciate some company. The girl gave a watery smile. That's kind of you, miss. Everyone else is too busy with the solicitor and all that business. I keep thinking about poor Mr. Harold and wondering if there was something I could have done. Miss Marple settled herself at the table. You mustn't torture yourself, my dear. What happened was not your fault. But I poured the champagne, didn't I? If there was something wrong with it, I'm the one who gave it to him. Tell me again about that bottle. Mrs. Brent told you to use it specifically. Annie nodded. Yes, miss. The morning of the wedding, she came into the pantry where I was arranging things. She had this bottle with a blue ribbon tied around the neck, and she said I was to pour from it and no other when it came time for the toast. She was very particular about it. And the bottle was already open? Yes, miss. I thought that was a bit odd. Champagne going flat and all, but Mrs. Brent said it had been opened just a moment before to let it breathe properly. I didn't know champagne needed to breathe like wine does, but then I'm just a housemaid. What do I know? Miss Marple's expression remained neutral, though inwardly she noted that champagne required no such treatment. Did you see Mrs. Brent open the bottle? Annie hesitated, and Miss Marple recognized the look. It was the expression of someone who had seen something troubling, but was reluctant to betray a confidence or accuse someone of standing. It's quite all right, Annie. Whatever you tell me will be in confidence. The girl twisted her apron. Well, miss, I did see her in the pantry earlier that morning, before she gave me the bottle. I'd come down to fetch the good silver, and there she was, standing by the shelf where we keep the wine. She had her back to me, but I could see she was doing something with a bottle. She had a small flask in her other hand, a blue one with a silver cap. Miss Marple's pulse quickened, though her voice remained gentle. "What sort of flask?" "Like the ones we use for storing cleaning solutions, miss. The housekeeper has several in the cupboard. This one looked like the bottle we use for the silver polish." "And what did Mrs. Brent do with it?" "She seemed to be pouring something from it into the champagne bottle. Just a little bit, carefully. Then she stoppered the champagne again and put the flask in her pocket. When she turned and saw me, she looked ever so startled. But then she smiled and said she'd been making sure the champagne was properly chilled, that she'd added a little ice to it." "Ice in champagne?" "That's what she said, miss. I thought it was peculiar, but like I said, I'm just a housemaid. Quality folk have their own ways of doing things." Miss Marple was quiet for a moment. "Annie, this is very important. What happened to that flask? The one with the blue label and silver cap?" "I don't know, miss. I never saw it again after that morning. Mrs. Brent must have taken it with her." "And the champagne bottle itself, the one I saw on the table after Mr. Harold died?" Annie's face crumpled. "That's just it, miss. After all the confusion, after they took Mr. Harold away, and everyone was crying and carrying on, I went to clear the table, but the bottle was gone. I looked everywhere for it, thinking maybe someone had knocked it over in the panic, but it wasn't there. Someone must have taken it. Who else was near the table during the confusion?" "Oh, miss, everyone was. It was chaos. People running about screaming, crying. Anyone could have taken that bottle." Miss Marple rose and moved to the pantry. It was a neat, well-organized room with shelves of preserves and cleaning supplies. She located the cupboard Annie had mentioned and opened it carefully. There were indeed several bottles with blue labels, most containing ordinary household cleaning solutions. She examined each one, noting their contents: silver polish, window cleaner, furniture oil, and there, pushed to the back of the shelf, a bottle that matched Annie's description exactly. Blue glass with a silver cap, but it was empty. Miss Marple lifted it carefully and sniffed the opening. Even empty, the scent was distinctive. Not the pleasant smell of silver polish, but something sharper, more acrid. And beneath that, faint but unmistakable, the bitter scent of almonds. She turned to find Dr. Haddock standing in the doorway, his expression grave. "I thought I might find you investigating, Miss Marple. May I see that bottle?" She handed it to him, and he examined it with professional care, holding it to the light and inhaling cautiously. "This contained cyanide," he said flatly, "or a compound very similar to it, the sort used in photographic development or jewelry cleaning, highly poisonous." Would such a substance smell of almonds? It would, and it would act quickly if ingested, causing precisely the symptoms Harold displayed: difficulty breathing, collapse, rapid death. He set the bottle down carefully. "I was wrong, Miss Marple. This was not heart failure. This was murder." Annie gave a small cry and pressed her hand to her mouth. Dr. Haddock moved quickly to steady her, guiding her to a chair. "Now, Annie, you must be brave. Can you tell me exactly what you told Miss Marple about seeing Mrs. Brent with this bottle?" The girl repeated her story, her voice shaking. When she finished, Dr. Haddock's expression was grim. "We must inform Constable Pulcher immediately. This is no longer a case of mysterious death. This is deliberate poisoning." Miss Marple nodded slowly. The pieces were falling into place with terrible clarity. Mrs. Brent had known about the inheritance condition. She had been anxious at the wedding, watching her son marry just days before the money would have been his alone. She'd been seen tampering with the champagne bottle, adding something from a flask of cyanide. And yet something still troubled Miss Marple. Something about the forged letter in Vera Colling's handwriting, about the elaborate nature of the deception. Mrs. Brent was not a stupid woman. If she had planned to poison her son, why leave so many traces? Why the theatrical arrangement with the special bottle and the blue ribbon? Why draw attention to herself? Unless, Miss Marple thought, the truth was even more complicated than it appeared. Unless there were layers to this tragedy that had not yet been revealed. "Dr. Haddock," she said quietly, "before we go to the constable, I wonder if you might answer a question. Would a sedative given in sufficient quantity produce similar symptoms to cyanide poisoning?" The doctor frowned. "It could if the dose was massive enough, but the almond scent could be added to disguise the true nature of the poison or to make it appear that cyanide was used when something else entirely had been administered." Dr. Haddock stared at her. "You think there might be two separate plots here?" "I think," Miss Marple said carefully, "that we have not yet uncovered all the secrets of that fatal wedding breakfast." Chapter 7. An Empty Bottle of Champagne. Tuesday morning found Miss Marple once again in the Linton house, this time at the express invitation of Constable Polker, who had developed a healthy respect for her powers of observation. The constable, a methodical young man more accustomed to dealing with poached rabbits than poisoned bridegrooms, had reached the conclusion that he required assistance. Mrs. Brent had been taken into custody the previous evening, protesting her innocence with considerable vigor. Her protests had done little to counter the evidence of Annie's testimony and the empty cyanide bottle found in the pantry. Yet Miss Marple remained troubled by aspects of the case that did not quite align. She stood now in the pantry where Annie had seen Mrs. Brent on the morning of the wedding. Examining the shelves with careful attention, Constable Polker watched her with the patience of a man who had learned that genius often worked in mysterious ways. "Then you're thinking there's something we've missed, miss?" "I'm thinking that things are sometimes arranged to appear one way when the truth is quite another." "May I see the shopping list that was found here?" Polker produced it from his notebook, a torn sheet with several items written in neat script. "Silver polish" headed the list, followed by candles, soap, and thread. Miss Marple studied the handwriting carefully. It was precise and controlled, each letter formed with deliberate care. She thought of the threatening letter that had been found in Harold's pocket, written in what appeared to be Vera Colling's hand, but with that same stiff precision. "Has anyone compared this writing to Mrs. Brent's usual hand?" "Well, no, miss. We assumed it was hers, seeing as it was found in her pantry." "Assumptions can be dangerous, Constable. Might I see some other samples of Mrs. Brent's writing?" This request sent Polker scurrying to find examples, and he returned shortly with several letters Mrs. Brent had written to the Lintons regarding wedding arrangements. Miss Marple examined them closely. The difference was subtle but unmistakable. Mrs. Brent's natural handwriting was more flowing, the letters connected in a smooth cursive. The shopping list showed the same stiff, careful formation as the threatening letter supposedly written by Vera Colling. "Someone has been practicing penmanship," Miss Marple murmured. "First copying Miss Colling's hand, then imitating Mrs. Brent's. The question is who, and to what purpose?" She moved to the window, looking out at the garden where the wedding breakfast had taken place just 4 days earlier. The tables had been cleared away, but she could still picture the scene. Harold raising his glass, Alice beside him, radiant. Mrs. Brent watching from her position near the refreshment table. Mrs. Brent, who had been so conveniently placed to be observed. Mrs. Brent, whose actions in the pantry had been witnessed by Annie Frost. Mrs. Brent, who stood to inherit 40,000 upon her son's death. It was all too obvious, too perfectly arranged like a stage play, where every action was calculated to direct the audience's attention to a particular conclusion. Miss Marple turned back to Polker. "Tell me, Constable, has the champagne bottle itself been found?" "No, miss. We've searched thoroughly, but it's disappeared. Likely thrown away by whoever poisoned it to hide the evidence, or kept by someone who wished to examine it more carefully." "Who had the opportunity to take that bottle in the confusion after Harold collapsed?" Polker consulted his notes. Near as we can tell, miss, almost anyone could have done. There was such panic, people running about. Annie says she was attending to Mrs. Alice, who'd fainted. Dr. Haddock was with Mr. Harold. Mr. Linton was calling for help. In all that confusion, someone could have slipped the bottle away quite easily. And where was Mrs. Brent during this time? Standing by the refreshment table, according to several witnesses, just standing there, white as a sheet, staring at her son. Miss Marple nodded slowly. A woman in shock, frozen by the horror of what she was witnessing, or a woman ensuring she was seen in a particular place, establishing her presence as alibi or diversion. She moved to the flour bin where Annie had said the empty cyanide bottle was hidden. It was an obvious hiding place, really too obvious for someone genuinely trying to conceal evidence, but perfect for someone who wanted the bottle to be found, who wanted suspicion to fall in a particular direction. Has Mrs. Brent admitted to purchasing cyanide? She says she keeps it for cleaning the family silver, says her mother taught her the method years ago, that it's common practice in households of quality. And is it? Polker looked uncomfortable. I wouldn't know, miss. My family never had silver that needed such cleaning. Miss Marple smiled slightly. Neither did mine, Constable. But I know something of household management, and while cyanide compounds were once used, for such purposes they have largely been replaced by safer alternatives. A woman of Mrs. Brent's generation would likely know this. So you're saying she wouldn't have had cyanide in the house? I'm saying it's worth questioning why she would claim to use it for silver cleaning when better methods exist. Either she's lying about her reason for possessing it, or someone else placed it there knowing it would implicate her. Polker scratched his head. But who would do such a thing, and why? Someone who wanted Harold Brent dead, but who also wanted to ensure the blame fell elsewhere. Someone clever enough to forge handwriting, to plant evidence, to manipulate circumstances so that suspicion would fall on the most obvious suspect. Mrs. Brent is the most obvious suspect. Miss, she had the inheritance to gain. Precisely, which makes her either very guilty or very convenient. Miss Marple moved toward the door, then paused. Tell me, Constable, has anyone examined the contents of Harold's glass, the actual liquid that remained in it? Dr. Haddock poured it away, miss. Said it was clearly poisoned and needed to be disposed of safely. Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly. How very thorough of him. And when did he do this? Right after the death, miss, before anyone else had a chance to examine it properly. I see. Miss Marple was quiet for a moment. Constable Polker, I wonder if you might do something for me. Would you ask Dr. Haddock about sedatives? Specifically, whether he prescribed any for Mrs. Brent or anyone else in the household in recent weeks. Sedatives, miss? I thought we'd established it was cyanide. We've established that there was a smell of bitter almonds, which suggests cyanide, but smells can be deceiving, and evidence can be arranged. I'm beginning to suspect that this murder was far more elaborate than we initially believed. She walked to the pantry door and looked back at the shelves with their neat rouse-off bottles and jars. Somewhere in this puzzle was a piece that would make everything clear, a piece that would explain why the evidence seemed almost too perfect, too carefully arranged, and she was beginning to suspect she knew where to find it. Come, Constable, she said briskly. I believe it's time we had another conversation with the bride, and perhaps with Miss Vera calling as well. I have a theory I should like to test, and I shall need all the principals gathered together to do so. Polker looked bewildered, but willing. If you say so, miss, though I still don't see how this changes things. Mrs. Brent had the motive, the opportunity, and the means. Indeed she did, Miss Marple agreed. Which is precisely what troubles me. In my experience, Constable, real murderers are rarely quite so obliging as to present every piece of evidence on a silver platter. When everything points in one direction, it's often wise to look in another. Chapter 8. The Confession Card. The wedding gifts had been displayed in the Linton morning room, and they remained there still, a poignant reminder of celebration turned to tragedy. Crystal vases, silver candlesticks, embroidered linens, all the ordinary objects that marked the beginning of a marriage now stood as monuments to its abrupt ending. Miss Marple had asked Alice to show her the gifts, and the young widow had agreed with quiet composure. She moved among the tables with steady steps, though her face remained pale and drawn. "People have been kind," Alice said softly. "Some have even asked if they should take their gifts back, but I couldn't bear that. It would be like admitting the marriage never happened. And it did happen. For 1 hour, I was his wife." "You were indeed, my dear, and nothing can change that." Miss Marple examined the display with interest. Most gifts were accompanied by cards, some with lengthy inscriptions, others with simple good wishes. She noted the handwriting on each, the turns of phrase, the varying degrees of formality. It was among the floral arrangements, now wilted and sad, that she found what she was looking for. The card was tucked behind a bouquet of white roses, unsigned and easy to overlook. Miss Marple picked it up carefully, handling it by its edges. On the front was a printed message of congratulations, but on the back, written in pencil, were the words Annie had mentioned to her earlier that morning. "Forgive me. It was meant to stop, not to kill." Alice drew in a sharp breath. "I've never seen that before. Where did it come from?" "Wash her among your gifts." "Did you not notice it when the police examined everything?" The police looked at the gifts, but they were searching for the champagne bottle. They didn't pay much attention to the cards." Alice's hand trembled as she reached for it. "What does it mean?" "Who wrote it?" Miss Marple studied the handwriting with care. The script was hurried, less controlled than the forged letters. The writer had been under stress, writing quickly without the deliberate precision of someone copying another's hand. "I believe," Miss Marple said slowly, "that this was written by someone whose conscience became unbearable after Harold's death, someone who had planned something quite different and was horrified by the actual result. But who, Mrs. Brent? Perhaps, though, I wonder if we might compare it to another sample of writing." Miss Marple withdrew from her handbag the paper on which Vera Calling had written at her request. She placed the two side by side. The handwriting was similar but not identical. Both showed a tendency to slope to the right. Both formed the letter G with a distinctive loop, but the confession card was written with greater agitation, the letters less even. Alice leaned closer. "It looks like the same person might have written both, but in different states of mind." "Precisely what I thought. And yet, when I showed Miss Calling the threatening letter found in Harold's pocket, she insisted she had not written it. I believed her because that letter showed the stiff precision of someone carefully copying her handwriting. This card shows no such artifice. This is someone's genuine hand, written in emotional distress." "Then Vera did write this." "She's confessing to something, certainly, but to murder? I'm not entirely convinced." Miss Marple moved to the window looking out at the garden. "Tell me, Alice, did you know about the inheritance condition, that Harold would lose the money if he married before his 30th birthday?" Alice's face flushed. "I knew. Harold told me about it a month before the wedding. He said it didn't matter, that he loved me more than money, that we would manage perfectly well without his uncle's fortune." "And you believed him?" "Of course I believed him. Harold was not a mercenary man. No, but his mother was a mercenary woman. She must have been desperate to prevent the marriage, or at least to delay it until after the crucial date." Alice was silent for a moment. "Mrs. Brent did try to persuade us to postpone the wedding. She said June was too warm, that September would be more pleasant, but Harold insisted. He said he'd waited long enough, that he wanted to marry me immediately. 3 days before his 30th birthday. One wonders if that timing was deliberate on his part." "What do you mean?" Miss Marple turned back to face her. I mean that perhaps Harold suspected his mother might try to interfere. By marrying just before the deadline, he was making a statement, choosing love over money, as you said, but also perhaps choosing independence from his mother's control. Alice sank into a chair. You think Mrs. Brent killed him because of that, 'cause he defied her? I think Mrs. Brent may have planned to prevent the marriage through less permanent means, a sedative perhaps, to make Harold too ill to proceed with the ceremony. A delay of a few days would have been sufficient to preserve the inheritance. But he died. He didn't just become ill, he died. Yes, which suggests the plan went terribly wrong. Or, Miss Marple paused, choosing her words carefully, that someone else had a different plan entirely. Before Alice could respond, there was a commotion in the hallway. Voices rose in argument, and then the drawing room door burst open. Vera Calling stood in the doorway, her face flushed and her eyes wild. I have to tell you, she gasped. I can't bear it anymore. I have to tell you the truth. Constable Poker appeared behind her looking flustered. I'm sorry, Miss Marple. She insisted on coming. Said she had to speak with you immediately. It's quite all right, Constable. Please, Miss Calling, come in and sit down. You look as though you might faint. Vera stumbled into the room and collapsed onto the sofa. Her hands shook as she clasped them in her lap. I didn't mean for him to die. You must believe me. I only wanted to stop the wedding. Alice made a small sound of distress. Miss Marple laid a gentle hand on her arm before addressing Vera. Perhaps you should start at the beginning, my dear. Take your time and tell us everything. Vera's story came out in fits and starts, punctuated by tears and protests. She had loved Harold, still loved him despite his rejection. When she learned of his impending marriage, she had been devastated. Mrs. Brent had approached her 2 weeks before the wedding with a proposition. She said if we worked together, we could delay the ceremony. Just a few days, that's all she wanted. Harold would get his inheritance, and then if he still wanted to marry Alice, so be it. But she couldn't bear to see him throw away his fortune. And you agreed to help her? I thought if the wedding was postponed, Harold might have time to reconsider, might remember what we once meant to each other. Vera's voice broke. Mrs. Brent had sleeping powders from Dr. Haddock. She said if we put a small amount in Harold's champagne, he would become drowsy, perhaps faint. The wedding would have to be delayed, and by the time he recovered, it would be past his birthday. But something went wrong, Marple said quietly. Yes, oh God, yes. I was supposed to add the powder to the champagne bottle, but I couldn't do it. My conscience failed me at the last moment, so I wrote that letter instead, warning Harold. I thought if he knew someone was plotting against him, he would be more careful, would perhaps even postpone the wedding himself. But the letter was in your handwriting. It would have pointed directly to you. Vera shook her head miserably. I disguised it as best I could and I didn't sign it. I thought Harold would recognize my hand but wouldn't be able to prove anything. Miss Marple nodded slowly. The pieces were beginning to fall into place. And the confession card? You wrote that after Harold died? Yes, I was so horrified, so guilty. Even though I hadn't gone through with the plan, I felt responsible. If I had warned Harold more clearly, if I had told someone what Mrs. Brent was planning. Mrs. Brent acted alone, Alice said, her voice hard. She poisoned Harold herself when Vera backed out. But, Miss Marple was frowning, her mind working through the implications. Miss Calling, you said Mrs. Brent had sleeping powders. Did she show them to you? Yes, they were in a small envelope, white powder, she said, Doctor. Haddock had prescribed them for her nerves. And you're certain it was sleeping powder? You didn't examine it more closely? Vera looked confused. Well, no. I assumed. Mrs. Brent said it was harmless. That it would only make Harold sleepy. Miss Marple turned to Constable Pulcher. I believe it's time we spoke with Dr. Haddock again, and we should release Mrs. Brent from custody. I don't think she's the murderer after all. Chapter 9. A marriage never meant to be. The vicarage drawing room had been chosen for the gathering at Miss Marple's request. It was neutral ground, and Reverend Clement had agreed readily, his pastoral instincts recognizing that truth often required a proper setting for its revelation. They assembled on Wednesday afternoon, a curious collection brought together by tragedy and suspicion. Mrs. Brent, released from custody but still under shadow, sat rigid in a high-backed chair. Vera Calling occupied the sofa, her eyes downcast. Alice remained near the window, supported by her father. Dr. Haddock stood by the mantelpiece, his expression troubled. Constable Pulcher positioned himself by the door, notebook at the ready. Miss Marple took her seat near the tea table, her hands folded peacefully in her lap. She looked, thought Constable Pulcher, like anyone's elderly aunt about to discuss the church fate. But her eyes held a sharp intelligence that made him grateful he was not the object of her scrutiny. Thank you all for coming, Miss Marple began. I know this has been a terrible ordeal, and I promise to be as brief as clarity permits. I have asked you here because I believe we've been looking at this tragedy from the wrong direction. We've been asking who killed Harold Brent when we should have been asking what killed him. Dr. Haddock shifted uncomfortably. I don't follow, Miss Marple. The man was poisoned. The smell of bitter almonds was unmistakable. Indeed it was. And that is precisely what troubles me. It was too unmistakable, too obvious, like a signpost pointing deliberately toward a particular conclusion. Miss Marple's gaze moved to Mrs. Brent. You conspired with Miss Calling to prevent the wedding, did you not? Mrs. Brent's face hardened. I've already admitted as much to the constable. I'm not proud of it, but I will not apologize for trying to protect my son's interests. That girl, she glanced at Alice with undisguised bitterness, would have cost him everything. You gave Miss Calling sleeping powders, or so you told her, to be added to Harold's champagne, a harmless dose to delay the ceremony. Yes, but Vera lost her nerve and didn't follow through, so I had to act myself. And did you add sleeping powders to the champagne? Mrs. Brent hesitated. I added what I believed to be sleeping powders, what Dr. Haddock had given me for my own use. All eyes turned to the doctor, who had gone pale. Mrs. Brent, he said carefully, I gave you no such prescription. You never complained of sleeplessness? But you did, Mrs. Brent insisted. 3 weeks ago, when I came to your surgery, you gave me an envelope of white powder and told me to take a small amount in warm milk before bed. Dr. Haddock shook his head firmly. I most certainly did not. I would remember such a prescription, and I have no record of it in my files. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. Doctor, where do you keep your medical supplies, your prescription medications? In the surgery, of course. In a locked cabinet to which only I have the key, and that key is always on your person. Well, no, it hangs in my office when I'm seeing patients, but no one would dare. He stopped, realization dawning on his face. Someone did dare, Miss Marple said quietly. Someone who had access to your surgery, who knew where you kept dangerous substances, and who could move about without arousing suspicion. Someone who gave Mrs. Brent an envelope of powder, claiming it came from you, knowing she would use it to drug Herson. But who would do such a thing? Mr. Linton demanded. And why? Miss Marple turned her gaze to Alice, who had gone very still by the window. Mrs. Brent, when you added the powder to the champagne, where exactly did you do this? Like in the pantry, on the morning of the wedding. I poured it into the bottle and marked it with a blue ribbon so Annie would know which one to serve. And you used all the powder in the envelope? Yes, all of it. I thought a stronger dose would be more certain to work. That was your mistake, Miss Marple said softly. You were meant to use all of it. The person who gave you that envelope was counting on your desperation, on your desire to ensure Harold would be incapacitated long enough to miss his wedding. But the envelope did not contain sleeping powder, Mrs. Brent. It contained cyanide. A collective gasp filled the room. Mrs. Brent swayed in her chair, and Vera cried out. You were meant to be the murderer, Miss Marple continued. Everything was arranged to ensure suspicion would fall on you. The forged letter in Vera's handwriting established jealousy as a motive. The convenient discovery of the cyanide bottle in the pantry. Your own actions witnessed by Annie, seemingly proving your guilt. You were trapped in a web spun by someone far more clever than you. But who? Mrs. Brent's voice was barely a whisper. Miss Marple's eyes met Alice's across the room. The person who stood to gain the most from Harold's death, the person who would inherit everything as his widow if he died after the marriage, but before his 30th birthday, the person who had easy access to Dr. Haddock's surgery, having visited it frequently in recent weeks to plan the wedding, to address her nerves, to ensure everything was perfect for her special day. Alice's face remained expressionless. That's absurd. I loved Harold. Perhaps you did, in your way, but you loved the idea of security more. You knew about the inheritance condition. You knew that if Harold lived 3 more days, the money would be his, and eventually yours. But you also knew that Mrs. Brent was plotting to prevent the marriage. You simply used her plot for your own purposes. You have no proof of this. Don't I? Miss Marple produced a small bottle from her handbag. This was found in your dressing table this morning, Mrs. Brent. I took the liberty of asking Annie to search your room. It's the bottle of cyanide from Dr. Haddock's surgery. The one supposedly found in the pantry was a duplicate you placed there to incriminate Mrs. Brent. Alice's composure cracked slightly. That proves nothing. Anyone could have put it there. True, but combined with your handwriting samples, with your access to Dr. Haddock's surgery, with your knowledge of Mrs. Brent's plot, and with your financial motive, it becomes rather compelling. Miss Marple's voice was gentle but plausible. You wrote the shopping list to implicate Mrs. Brent. You gave her the cyanide disguised as sleeping powder. You ensured Annie would witness her in the pantry, and you made certain the evidence would point in every direction but your own. The silence stretched like a taut wire. Then Alice laughed, a short, bitter sound. Harold was a fool. He would have thrown away $40,000 for sentiment. Well, I'm not a fool. I saw an opportunity and I took it. Her father made a sound of anguish. Constable Polker moved forward, but Alice held up her hand. Save your energy, Constable. I'm not going anywhere. She turned to Miss Marple with something like respect in her eyes. How did you know? What gave me away? Your grief, Miss Marple said simply, or rather your lack of it. You played the bereaved widow well, but you were too composed, too controlled. Real grief is messier, less dignified. Yours was a performance, and a very good one. But I've seen true sorrow, my dear, and yours was not quite right. Chapter 10. The Ring in the Teacup. The rain had returned to Elmsby, a steady June downpour that turned the village lanestow, ribbons of mud, and set the eaves dripping with melancholy persistence. Miss Marple stood at the window of her cousin's cottage, watching the water stream down the glass and blur the world beyond into impressionistic shapes. It had been 2 days since Alice Brent's confession in the vicarage drawing-room, 2 days since Constable Polker had led her away, her father following with the broken gait of a man who had lost everything that mattered. 2 days since the truth had emerged from beneath layers of deception and carefully constructed lies. The village was still reeling. Miss Marple had heard the whispers in the post office, the shocked conversations in the churchyard. No one had suspected Alice. She had played her part too well. The grieving bride, the innocent victim. Even Miss Marple had to acknowledge a certain cold brilliance in the girl's scheme. "Such a terrible business," Mabel said, settling into the chair opposite with her knitting. "To think that sweet young thing was capable of such wickedness. It makes one wonder if we can trust anyone at all." "I don't think Alice was ever particularly sweet," Miss Marple observed mildly. "Composed, certainly, intelligent, undoubtedly, but sweetness requires a warmth of heart that she did not possess. Still, to murder one's own husband on one's wedding day, it's monstrous." "It was calculated," Miss Marple corrected. "Alice saw an opportunity in Mrs. Brent's desperation and Vera Colling's lingering affection. She manipulated both women, using their own plots to construct her alibi while she committed the actual crime. It was clever. I'll grant her that much." Mabel shuddered. "And poor Mrs. Brent to be made an accomplice to her own son's murder. How will she bear it? Mrs. Brent will bear it as she has borne everything else in her life, with rigid dignity and considerable bitterness. She's not a warm woman, but she loved her son in her fashion. That love led her to conspire against his happiness, which is its own form of tragedy. Do you think Harold knew about the inheritance condition and his mother's plot?" Miss Marple considered this. "I believe he suspected his mother might try to interfere, which is why he insisted on marrying precisely when he did. 3 days before his 30th birthday was a deliberate choice, a statement of independence. What he did not suspect was that his bride was far more dangerous than his mother ever could be." A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Mabel rose to answer it and returned with Vera Colling, who looked pale and drawn but more composed than when Miss Marple had last seen her. "I hope I'm not intruding," Vera said hesitantly. "I wanted to thank you, Miss Marple, before you left Elmsby. If you hadn't uncovered the truth, I would have lived the rest of my life thinking I was partly responsible for Harold's death." "You must not blame yourself. My dear, your conscience prevented you from following through with Mrs. Brent's plan, which is to your credit, but I agreed to it in the first place. I was willing to drug Harold to sabotage his wedding all because I couldn't accept that he had chosen someone else." Vera's voice trembled. "What does that make me?" "Human," Miss Marple said simply. "Flawed and foolish, perhaps, but human. We're all capable of poor judgment when our hearts are engaged. The difference is that you stopped yourself before committing an irreversible act. Alice Linton did not." Vera sat down, accepting the tea that Mabel poured for her. "The magistrate said I won't be charged with anything, given that I didn't actually drug the champagne. But Mrs. Brent will face charges for conspiracy and attempted poisoning, even though she didn't know the powder was cyanide." "The law must take its course," Miss Marple said, "though I suspect Mrs. Brent's sentence will be lenient given the circumstances. She's as much a victim of Alice's manipulation as anyone." "Dr. Haddock is devastated," Vera continued. "He blames himself for not keeping his surgery more secure." "If Alice hadn't been able to steal the cyanide—" "If wishes were horses, beggars would ride," Miss Marple quoted gently. "Dr. Haddock could not have anticipated such wickedness. Few of us could." They sat in silence for a moment, listening to the rain drum against the windows. Miss Marple sipped her tea and reflected on the curious mathematics of human nature. 2 women had plotted against Harold Brent, both believing they were acting in his best interest, or at least with some measure of justification. Neither had succeeded in their aims. But a 3rd woman, the one Harold had loved and trusted most, had used their plots as cover for murder most calculated. "What will happen to Alice?" Vera asked quietly. "She will stand trial for murder. The evidence is substantial. The cyanide bottle found in her possession, her handwriting on the forged documents, her access to Dr. Haddock's surgery, and most damning of all, her own confession. I imagine the verdict is not in doubt, and the inheritance will revert to Mrs. Brent, as originally intended." though I suspect she would gladly surrender every penny to have Herson back. Miss Marple set down her teacup. Money is a curious thing, Miss Calling. People kill for it, lie for it, betray those they love for it. Yet in the end, it cannot buy the things that matter most. Harold Brent died for $40,000, but no amount of money could restore him to life or ease the grief of those who genuinely loved him. Vera's eyes filled with tears. I did love him, Miss Marple. Despite everything, despite his rejection, I loved him. I would never have harmed him. I know, my dear, and I believe Harold knew it too, in his way. That is why you must not carry guilt for his death. You are innocent of that crime, whatever your other failings might be. After Vera had left, Miss Marple returned to her position by the window. The rain was easing now, and through the clouds she could see a pale glimmer of sunshine struggling to emerge. Mabel joined her, following her gaze. What are you thinking about, Jane? About weddings and funerals, Miss Marple replied. How both ceremonies strip away pretense and reveal character. Harold Brent's wedding revealed more than anyone anticipated. Not just love, but greed, jealousy, and murderous calculation. In the end, it became his funeral as well. You said something like that to Alice, didn't you? Before you knew she was guilty? Did I? How prescient of me. Miss Marple smiled slightly. I told her that weddings and funerals both reveal character, but only one offers a second chance. I was thinking of the opportunity for renewal, for growth. What I did not realize was that for Alice, the wedding was meant to be both, a beginning for her and an ending for Harold. It's so sad. All of it. Yes, it is. But there is hope as well, Mabel. Mrs. Brent will have time to reflect on how possessive love can poison relationships. Vera Calling will learn to let go of what cannot be reclaimed. Even Mr. Linton, devastated though he's, will eventually find peace in knowing the truth rather than living with a lie. Through the window, Miss Marple watched as the sun finally broke through the clouds, casting golden light across the wet grass and making theron drops sparkle like diamonds. The church bells of St. Mildred's began to toll, marking the hour with solemn beauty. She thought of Harold Brent, who had chosen love over money and paid for that choice with his life. She thought of the wedding confetti that had been washed away by Saturday's rain, and of the earring that Alice had worn for only an hour before becoming a widow, and shortly thereafter, a murderer. Shall we have more tea? Mabel asked, ever practical. Yes, I think we shall, Miss Marple replied. And perhaps some of those biscuits you made yesterday. There is something comforting about tea and biscuits after a difficult case. They remind us that life continues, that simple pleasures endure even after tragedy. As they settled back into their chairs, Miss Marple reflected that she would be leaving Elmsby soon, returning to St. Mary Mead and the familiar routines of Huron Village. But she would carry with her the memory of this case, filed away with all the others in that remarkable collection of human folly and wickedness she had accumulated over the years. The poisoned bridegroom would join the gardener's nephew who stole from the church funds, the respectable widow who'd been anything but respectable, and all the other specimens of human nature she had observed and understood. Each case taught her something new about the depths to which people could sink and occasionally the heights to which they could rise. Outside, the rain had stopped completely, and a blackbird began to sing in the dripping hedge. Life, Miss Marple thought, had a way of asserting itself even in the face of death. The seasons would turn, new weddings would be celebrated at St. Mildred's, and the village would eventually forget the tragedy of Harold Brent and his poisoned wedding breakfast. But Miss Marple would not.